Chapter 6: Experimental Research Design. The experimental research answered the question, what if? The researcher manipulates independent variables, examples, types of treatment, teaching methods, communication strategy, and measure-dependent variables, anxiety level, English comprehension strategy, in order to establish cause and effect relationship between them. The independent variables is controlled or set by the researcher. Dependent variables. The dependent variables is measured by researcher. The threats to experimental research is internal validity and external validity. Internal validity asks the questions, are the measurements I make on my dependent variables influenced only by the treatment, or are there other influence which change it? External validity, to how much the results are generalized to target population. The threats to internal validity is first the history, an event happens during the experiment. Next the maturation, participants get older and other changes. The next selection, non-random selection, may lead to biases. The mortality, participants drop out or can't continue. The testing, being in the study actually influences how the participants respond. And lastly, the statistical regression, a regression towards the mean. If you select the participants based on high or low scores, their scores later tend to move towards the mean. Threats to external validity. Reactive effects of testing. Since the population at large is not tested, experimental effects may be due to the testing procedures rather than the treatment itself. This reduces generalizability. Treatment and subject interaction. Subjects in the sample may react to the experimental treatment in ways that are hard to predict. This limits the ability of the researcher to generalize findings outside the experimental itself. Testing and subject interaction. The testing and subject interaction. Subjects in a sample may react to the process of testing in ways that are hard to predict, and also limits the ability of the researcher to generalize findings outside the experimental itself. There are two types of experimental research, the quasi-experimental and true experimental. The only difference in the two is that the quasi-experimental cannot randomly assign subjects to groups, while true experimental can randomly assign subjects to groups. To understand more about quasi and true experimental, the true experimental emphasize the internal validity, assess cause and effect, while the quasi-experiments emphasize external validity and describe real or naturally occurring events. The true experiments participants randomly assigned and blind to assignment, while the quasi-experiments, non-equivalent groups, participants not blind. And lastly, the true experiments control study procedures and manipulate independent variable, while the quasi-experiments may not be able to manipulate the independent variable. Pre-experimental design classified depending on whether there is an involvement of one or more groups, and whether the groups are post-tested only or both pre-tested and post-tested. The one-shot case study, single group of subjects, is measured on a variable following experimental stimulus. The one-group pre-test post-test design adds a pre-test for the group, but lacks a control group. The static group comparison includes experimental and control group, but not pre-test. In one-shot case studies, the chosen group is exposed to the treatment, and then it is tested only once for the purpose of measuring the degree of change on the dependent variable after the treatment. It is called one-group pre-test post-test design because the two tests are administered to the same group. In static group comparison study, after one group receives the treatment, all group are post-tested. This design has better control over most of the variables. The classification of true experimental design is made accordingly. The post-test only control group design, the pre-test post-test control group design, Solomon 4 group design. In post-test only control group, subjects are randomly selected and assigned to two groups. Due to randomization, the two groups are statistically equal. In pre-test post-test control group, two randomly selected groups are measured before 0-1 and 0-3. After 0-2 and 0-4, one of the groups receives a treatment. It is the combination of pre-test post-test control group, which is R1 and R2, and post-ist-only control group design, which is R3 and R4. This case, subjects are randomly selected and placed into four group. The term quasi means almost, near, partial, and somewhat. Quasi-experimental design are used when true experiments cannot be done. Here are classification of quasi-experimental design. Time series. Establish a baseline measure of subjects by administering a series of tests over time. Expose the group to the treatment and then measures the subjects with another series of tests. Non-equivalent control group design. Subjects are tested in existing and intact groups rather than being randomly selected. The dotted line in the diagram represent non-equivalent groups. Both groups are measured before and after treatment. Lastly, the counterbalance design. Subjects are not randomly selected, but are used intact groups. Group 1 receives treatment 1 and test 1. Then at a later time, they receives treatment 2 and test 2. Group 2 receives treatment to first time.